Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on preparing your Australian local file. The purpose of today's session is to launch CCH Integrator's Australian local file solution, which we've been developing over the last 6 months to help multinational corporations subject to country-by-country reporting to streamline and automate the preparation and electronic lodgement of the Australian local file to the ATO. Your presenters today are Jim Edwards, Director of Product, and Daniel Levin, our Solutions Enablement Leader at Wolters Kluwer. Unfortunately, due to time constraints with today's session, we won't be taking questions we won't be answering questions at the end of the session. Feel free to submit them through the chat box and someone will respond to these questions after the session. Over to you, Jim and Daniel. I'll pass the screen control to you.
Thanks, David, and welcome everyone to today's session of our Australian local file solution. So the agenda for today's session is really a follow-up to a number of sessions we've held over the last few months. So we started this journey in March of this year with Jim and I travelling around the country to present on demystifying the XML schema, i.e. the ATO's method for which they would like you as multinationals to submit your Australian local file to the tax office electronically. And we met with around 500 of you around the country over that time and got some fantastic insights into the process that you're currently undertaking through your IDS preparation, where those pain points exist, and how you're sort of the challenges that you're sort of facing going forward with your Australian local file preparation, which is largely similar to the IDS, but now far more onerous in terms of the information that you need to report to the tax office. Not to mention that this now needs to be transmitted electronically and not via a form. So today what we're going to be doing is talking about our specific Australian local file solution in CCH Integrator. We'll be running a short demo of the solution towards the middle to latter parts of this presentation. But initially what we want to do is just cover some context and background on the solution itself and some of the requirements, and then we'll move into demonstration mode. All right, so firstly, for those of you who didn't attend our session, I think it's just worth just recapping a little bit with where exactly the journey sort of started and where it's moving towards. So many of you who prepared an IDS in the past, which forms part of your Form C income tax return here in Australia, have been used to completing this form. It's a significant pain point for many multinational organisations in terms of the tax return process. It is generally, well, speaking to most corporations out there, the most difficult form to complete in the Form C in terms of time constraints and effort required. Speaking to a lot of corporations from around the country, they have indicated to us that it on average takes them 3 to 5 weeks just to complete this form currently. And there's a lot of risk attached to this, given the scrutiny amongst multinationals, not just in Australia but globally. There's obviously very heightened scrutiny around the BEPS initiative that was started back in 2012. And here in Australia, we've had lots of legislative changes over the last few years, with new transfer pricing laws being enacted a few years ago, the diverted profits tax coming in into force this year, the MEL as well. So there's lots happening in the international tax space. The other thing that's happening, though, specifically from a country-by-country reporting requirement, is that the Australian Tax Office has significantly deviated with what they would like you to prepare by way of the Australian local file. So the OECD set up some guidance in 2014 when they released their BEPS Action 13 report around country-by-country reporting. So guidance around what you need to prepare for your master file, your local file, and the CBC report. The master and local files largely follow transfer pricing documentation, albeit at different levels. Master file being a bit more high level, local file being at that local operating level. The Australian local file is very different, and one of the reasons for that is because there are current transfer pricing documentation rules in place in Australia, your 284E documentation requirements, which many of you will be preparing and nominating that you've actually prepared documentation for the transactions that you're disclosing on your IDS. And there's a lot of duplication between the information that's contained in your 284E requirements and in your OECD local file requirements. So the ATO has deviated. They've asked you to submit information, largely numeric information, along with a number of intercompany legal agreements, as well as your master file and a copy of your financial accounts as well, to the tax office electronically in this local file. So what you're seeing on screen here is really a case of moving from the present, a form, into the future, which is code And for most tax managers out there or transfer pricing managers, when you see that on screen, it looks a bit scary, because how are you going to produce that code when really your job is to actually do a lot of the tax compliance and advisory work, not to be an IT boffin and generate code. Also at the bottom, you can see a couple of icons, and the reason why we put those icons there is because it really summarizes how the transmission of this information is currently sent through to the tax office. So on the IDS, you now have currently have a method to submit this information either via a paper form. So if you're lodging your tax return in a paper base, you can walk it over to the tax office and hand it in, or you can submit it electronically by SBR. So it's really a people to sort of machine or systems based channel of submitting that information through. In the future, that will no longer be the case. It will be a machine-to-machine or system-to-system way of submitting this information through. And that's exactly why a software solution has to be used to prepare this information. You cannot prepare this information using a simple Office-based application like Excel or Access. You need some specific application to generate that XML file. Okay, so this is just a very quick summary of the mandatory dates for filing, which many of you would be familiar with. So we haven't covered every single year in here, but I think the key theme is that everyone can't really wait too much longer. You now have really over the next 18 months, all taxpayers will be really captured in terms of having to file their CBC reporting requirements, and in particular today we're talking about the local file. Many of you would be aware that there's an administrative concession in place that the ATO has outlined for significant global entities, i.e. those entities that are subject to CBC reporting, to lodge Part A of their local file early instead of their IDS, or specifically questions 2 to 17 of their IDS. So Part A effectively becomes a substitute to questions 2 to 17 of your IDS. And the reason for that is just to avoid further duplication. So if we take the example of a 31 December year-end early balancer, 31 December year-ends they'll be the first taxpayers that are required to lodge their CBC reporting statements. They have the option, they've got two options. So you can either lodge Part A of your local file with your tax return. It's not specifically with the tax return, but must be lodged on the same day as your tax return when you lodge that this year in July. And then you will not need to complete questions 2 to 17 of your IDS, but you'll need to complete questions 1 to 18, which is your branch transactions and the subsequent schedules of the IDS as well. Then come December of this year, you will then need to lodge by 31 December 2017 your Part B intercompany legal agreements, as well as your any APAs, master file, and a local master file to the tax office, as well as your CBC report. So really what you're doing there is just lodging Part A early, and then the subsequent requirements for the local file. If you choose to lodge your IDS with your tax return in July, you will need to lodge Part A, Part B, your master file, and your financial accounts in December. So you have an advantage there over further compliance duplication. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about your current IDS preparation process, which is really, as I said before, a very painful process for many of you. Even if you're a fairly simple multinational, say an inbound here in Australia, that doesn't necessarily mean that your IDS preparation process is that simple. It often is the case where inbounds find that's the most time-consuming and risk area within the tax return process. So if we just look at this diagram that we've got on screen now, we've got really the process for preparing your IDS. So you start off with sourcing your transactions from your source systems, your ERP, your GL, your AP, AR systems, whether it's an SAP or an Oracle or something more of a legacy system out there. You source that data out. Usually it's very raw. It's the data can be quite messy. It needs to be cleansed. You then decide to actually create an Excel template or templates to then copy, paste, identify, group, sort, filter, transpose, and summarize these transactions. So these Excel templates are being created by US taxpayers to effectively get your IDS disclosures into a format so that those disclosures can then be populated into the IDS form. And that's a really painful process, because often it's, the source data is not necessarily very clean. There is a lot of issues around code blocks that you have to try and memorize and identify what exactly a particular code relates to a specific type of transaction. There's not always a very clear descriptor within your source system about what transaction type it relates to what particular code within your source system. You've got to use pivot tables and VLOOKUPs and other functions within that process as well. And there's a lot of risk attached to it with very little audit trail. And I think, Jim, we certainly found, speaking with a number of corporate taxpayers, this is really the most high risk area for them in their tax return preparation process.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's probably the crux of the complexity of the IDS preparation and now local file preparation. And it's only going to get more complicated with the local file disclosures because of the more granular transactional disclosure, but equally the other supplemental information that also needs to be disclosed beyond the simple financial figures. The other point to note, I think, there is that most corporations only have a single person within the tax function that's actually responsible for this preparation, who's then relied upon collecting a lot of this source information from other financial controllers in the organisation. So there's a lot of risk associated with the individual's memory as to how they go about this, producing this process or repeating this process each year. Hence, that's why we've produced some technology to help automate that.
The other thing too, as well, and that's really important, Jim, a lot of that information is stored in that person's head. So if they leave the organisation, all of that information goes with them. It's not necessarily documented particularly well. And then really just the last point of this process is that you often, particularly inbounds, tend to get their advisors to review and file this information as well. And that tends to be a very, painful process for advisors as well, because it's, they're almost recreating the IDS when they get that information through.
Yeah, and often because they don't understand people's spreadsheets that they've been using as a source.
Correct.
Yeah.
So now we're going to sort of talk about what we've done in terms of a solution going forward for the local file and what we've come up with. And our solution, we're very excited to launch our Australian local file solution today, starting with the first part of the solution, which is our new data transformer robot, affectionately called Bob the Robot. And Bob's here for you to help you streamline and automate the process of preparing your numeric disclosures for Part A of the local file. So that's really the real pain point of the current IDS process. We wanted to go and build a solution to help you with that and really get you to avoid having to use Excel as your reliance tool to be able to prepare these disclosures. I certainly, speaking from experience, having prepared many IDSs over the years, this is really something that I know as an ex-transfer pricing advisor and practitioner, I was looking for a long time as a software solution to help with this. It takes a significant amount of time to prepare these IDSs. So now we're launching Bob. Okay. So this is really an overview of what the future looks like for the Australian local file. And if we just talk about the solution in, I guess, two parts. So we've got our local file data transformer, or Bob. Again, we're sourcing the transactions from our source systems on the left-hand side. But we now have Bob in the middle there, replacing all of those Excel spreadsheets and templates that you might have designed and customized yourself. And Bob's really there as a robot for you to teach him your rules and teach him how to process those rules and to repeat those rules in future processes, so that when it comes to your second local file that you can present or prepare rather, you can then roll forward a lot of your transactions from year one and then get Bob to, I guess, repeat a lot of the processes that you've taught him in that first year. And Bob's really designed to, I guess, as I said before, streamline and automate that particular process rather than you relying on certain pivot tables and other functions that you would have otherwise in Excel. The next process then, once Bob has automated the process of preparing your numeric disclosures, and then to feed that information directly into CCH Integrator, our cloud-based solution that's used by many corporations here in Australia and globally, over 300, to do a lot of their corporate income tax preparation and compliance reporting. It is a cloud-based solution that you can collaborate with internally within your in-house tax team, as well as with advisors as well from a review perspective. So Bob will feed that numeric data into the CCH Integrator Australian local file disclosures, Part A specifically. You will then go into CCH Integrator and upload the attachments for Part B of the local file, as well as a copy of your master file and your financial accounts as well. From there, you'll be able to validate all of the work that you've done in the system using the ATO's SBR, or Standard Business Reporting Validation Rules, which they've released to us as a software developer, before you then produce the XML file to lodge to the ATO via SBR. Sounds fairly simple. All right. So I think it's probably a good time now, Jim, to show our solution.
Jump into a demonstration. So first I'm going to jump directly into looking at Bob the bot. Now, let's get some screens out of the way, sorry. There we go. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to launch Bob the bot. Now, Bob the robot is basically a desktop application, so it gets deployed to your local machine. Now, we've designed the application to have a very simplified look and feel. So we've followed Excel as a principle to make it very, very easy for users to then understand and work with. So as Daniel was saying before, there's really two steps in using Bob. First, we need to teach Bob on how to do those mundane tasks as part of the preparation of the IDS or now local file, and how to do all of those cleansing and preparation, data grouping and summarising steps. And you effectively need to teach it, how is it you're flowing data from your source systems into the ATO's disclosures. Then once we've taught Bob, and that's a fairly simple process to actually teach him, we've done this now for a bunch of clients as part of a beta testing process over the last month or so, and we found that we can quite efficiently train Bob. But once he's been taught, then we're just going to run mode. So for today's example, we have a company, a fictitious company called ABC Co. ABC Co operates in a number of jurisdictions and has a range of different transactions. Daniel?
Yeah, just set a little bit of context for today's fact pattern. So we've got ABC Company, so it's an Australian subsidiary of a foreign headquartered multinational, and they currently have transactions with 4 countries within their group, and they also have 4 different types of broad intercompany transaction types as well. So those are specifically services, license fees, rent and leasing, and financial dealings. Now, bear in mind, as many of you would be familiar with the IDS, there are multiple types of service transaction types in question 8 of the IDS. The same thing applies in the local file part A. So what we have over here is those 4 broad categories of transactions, but there's lots of subcategories of transactions within those specific headline ones that I mentioned just before. Now, ABC Australia also uses SAP to record all of their intercompany transactions, so that's their source system. And then really now, I think now Bob knows that every company is different and records transactions in different systems and different attributes and codes.
Yeah, so for now, we've already taught Bob how to do with ABC Co. So we're just going to go straight into run mode. So I launch application, go into run mode. Now the first thing is I need to point Bob towards the memory. So last time, we call it a robot file. So last time we ran Bob, we taught Bob and we saved the learnings of Bob into this robot file. We'll just call it ABC transformation. So I open that and the transformation rules have then been loaded. Now what I need to do is go away and actually open the current source information, and that's going to be my latest extract from my source system. Now, of course, as Daniel was saying before, every corporation is different. Everyone's using different source systems. They're using different coding systems. More often than not, there's more than one source system. Often you might be able to get some higher level balances in the general ledger, but you need to supplement that with, APAR, or you may have another subsystem that captures intercompany transactions, particularly those of a financial nature. So, for example, from Treasury. So all different sources. But here's an example of just how we're going to run through today with one source. So we go away and open the extract from the general ledger. Now this is going to include the transactions, all of the intercompany transactions for ABC Co between the Australian entities and all of the related parties. So they'll run an extract from SAP with each of those appropriate filters being applied. So you can see here's the raw file that's actually been loaded into Bob. Now, of course, as a typical extract from the general ledger or APAR system, it's got a whole bunch of header information here, which is, just sort of gets in the way. Eventually, we come down to a bunch of column headings, and then it goes into the detail of all the transactions. You can see here we've got a little over 1,000 transactions that have been loaded. Now you can see in this file here, I've got a transaction code, an account code, some transaction dates and cost centers and reporting periods, and eventually we get to the amounts and descriptions and the related party who we traded with. So what we've taught Bob before is all about this file format. So we've taught him that there's blank rows that can be ignored. We've told him where the column headings are, where the data starts, what these column headings actually mean, and what they mean in terms of how they relate back to the terms which we know. So we know that the related party 4,000 my Singapore entity, which is a marketing entity. So that kind of additional contextual and meaning about the data, we teach that to Bob so that it can then help prepare the local file disclosure. So now if I jump across to the Prepare tab, we can see what Bob's applied the learnings from last time. So I'm looking at exactly the same set of data, so the 1,100 odd rows. But now what you can see he's done is Bob's gone away and cleaned up all of the junk data. So he's got rid of the spaces, he's applied column headings. And in addition to those 6 or 7 column headings we had to begin with, he's actually added some additional information in here as well. So if I scroll a little bit across to the right, I can now start to see the actual transaction types. So Bob's gone away and based upon the codings that have been applied, the account codes and the related reporting units and counterparties, Bob's been able to work out the corresponding transaction types, which I'll jump to in a minute as to how Bob actually did that. So eventually, moving right across the road, you can see Bob's also then gone and looked up the ABN and TFN of the local Australian entities that have had the counterparty transactions. It's also found out the counterparty name, which country the counterparty is from, the corresponding code, and this is an ATO code, the ATO 2-digit code for the country. Bob's also then been able to identify whether or not these transactions are a revenue or a capital nature, and then he's gone through and actually identified the transaction balances. Okay, so he's gone away and converted that sort of fairly raw set of data into a set of data that's now ready to go away and group and summarise and map into an output. But just before I go into that mapping and output process, I just want to show you the corporate dictionary, because this is a key part of Bob's brain. So when we were first teaching Bob, we taught him a bit about the format of the files, but we also taught him about the corporate dictionary. So with every corporation, every source system is using a series of different codes, like we mentioned before. With this example, ABC company, we've got related parties, reporting units, accounts, and then we've got countries. So, we need to somehow look up a list. So Bob's corporate dictionary, or ABC company's corporate dictionary, includes their list of related parties, all of their account codes. Here's the account code description. And where possible, for ABC code, they've been able to go through and identify for this individual type of transaction or account code, the corresponding IDS transaction type. So where possible, we've been able to use the account coding system of ABC code to flow directly into the corresponding ATO's code. Now, again, no two companies are the same, and not every company has the luxury of being able to map their internal general ledger account codes directly into ATO disclosures. And we've got the same fact pattern here for ABC code. You can see for the swaps and derivatives transaction, for the swaps transactions, there is no ability to automate the associated IDS transaction, the local file transaction type. So we've actually had to go away and combine the account, the reporting unit, and related party to then derive the local file transaction type.
I think it's also important to note, what we're really saying here, Jim, is, usually through the IDS preparation process currently at the moment, that corporate dictionary is not really in existence.
No, it's not. No, it's in
the heads of people, right? And it's or someone's having to go back to the source system and look up certain things and try to memorize this code means this.
Yep.
What we're saying now is you teach Bob those particular processes and corporate dictionary terms, and Bob will have it as permanent library reference source.
Correct. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move fairly quickly now because we've only got another 8 minutes or so left. So now at the end of the process, we've taught Bob again how to basically take that source input data, so all of those columns of input data, and the enhanced data that Bob's been able to prepare, and how it then gets mapped into the local file disclosure. These are the columns on the left-hand side here. Now, once that mapping's been done, and we've explained to Bob how that all works, we then click the Run button. Bob will then go through and rerun those rules that he learnt last time. He's going to go through, remove the garbage heading, blank lines, footers that appear in reports that have been extracted from SAP. It's going to go through and filter the transactions, removing any transactions that are between Australian parties, so it's only going to focus on the international transactions, and it's going to flow it into the disclosures. So now Bob's taking me directly to the output, and you can see there the 1,100 transactions has been summarised into 148. And this is the 148 which is going to be disclosed to the ATO. And if I scroll to the right, you can see all the various different attributes. Eventually we get to the total sum of the underlying transactions for each of the appropriate disclosures. So at this point, we now jump across to CCH Integrator. Now, some of you will already be aware of CCH Integrator. Integrator is a cloud-based platform that supports corporate compliance and reporting around the world. Already being used by many, many corporations within Australia and beyond for corporate income tax compliance provision, statutory account production, GST and VAT transaction analysis and return preparation. But for today's example, of course, we're talking about the local file. So you can see here I've got a workbook in Integrator which has been created purely for the Australian local file. Now, the workbook for the Australian local file, this is basically where all of the users within your organisation or anyone who's responsible for the finalisation, review and sign off and electronic filing will collaborate together through this cloud platform to complete the disclosures. So you can see here in the local file, it's divided into 3 sections. We've got an overview, Part A, Part B. Now again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of the detail here, but the overview, I'm just going to go through this very quickly. The overview is where it's basically just providing a very high-level overview about all the other attributes about your organisation, which need to be then disclosed across to the ATO. Daniel, you want to talk to a couple of points?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, it's just, we're not going to show it today, but the ATO has released lots of meta-structured tables, which I like their design in Excel of how the local file disclosure should look. So many of you may have seen that as part of the consultation process, and it's very confusing because it's really designed for systems people and IT boffins to be able to interpret that. What we've done now is taken that structure and turned it into some more consumable, easily consumed forms online through our system over here. So as Jim was sort of pointing out, this is really an overview of what you need to complete as background information, so including your ABNs, your TFNs, those attributes, whether you're going to be submitting a CBC report separately, whether you've got exemption criteria, whether you're eligible for the short form local file, and the like. So you just have to go through the process of answering generally yes and no responses, and in some cases completing some text field responses to this particular schedule.
Yeah, and once completed, all this information then rolls forward year to year. So it's only a year one setup activity, and then each year thereon, you're just reviewing it for changes.
Absolutely. So really the meat's in the next one, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So once we're past the overview, we move into Part A. Now, we're looking here at ABC Co's disclosure for those 148 transactions. So once I load this screen, you'll see all of the information that's already been gathered and collected through Bob has been loaded into Integrator, pre-filling the financial disclosure attributes, the transaction types, pre-filling the ABNs, TFNs of the Australian entities that are trading with the corresponding counterparties, etc. So you can see here, if I'm loading up the screen here, which shows Part A. If I just scroll across, here's the ATO's Part A disclosure broken down into a tabular form. So the fields here, you can see it's all been populated with particular the identifiers which Bob has generated for the transactions to be disclosed, the types of transactions, again the ABNs and TFNs, the actual non-resident party we're trading with in the country that they operate within, and eventually through the amounts of disclosure. Now you'll notice here that there are a number of lists or drop-down lists of information that need to be provided. So there's other qualitative type information which also needs to be disclosed as part of Part A. That information can't be generated or derived automatically by Bob, so you'll go through the process of actually completing through these drop-down lists.
Absolutely, and that's new information as well. So I mean, the capital transaction one that you just said there's not new, but where you've got, say, for example, the name of the counterparty, that is something that hasn't necessarily been required in the IDS previously.
Yep.
You would have gathered that information in the preparation process, but not actually disclosed it to the tax office.
Yep.
So you now need to complete that in Part A.
So as part of that preparation and finalisation phase, you can also go through then attach notes and other file attachments as well. And it's really important to then explain the audit trail behind the disclosures you've prepared. You might have external emails or other guidance which explains how you've arrived at a particular disclosure. You may even have an Excel spreadsheet which actually substantiates some of these disclosures that you're making. Whatever that is, attach it here in context so it's easily reviewed and recalled in future as well. So that's it for Part A. At the end of this process, we then track that process through to completion. We execute the ATO's validations. We're just getting those finalised at the moment in the product. But that's where we go through and we certify that all information provided will pass the ATO's tests and will be successfully able to be submitted. And then it gets electronically filed across the ATO's channel. Part B relates to intercompany agreements. Now, we're still working with the ATO on exactly how Part B will be disclosed. They, of course, have provided guidance on what those disclosures look like. But in terms of the identification of intercompany agreements, we're still working through specifically on identifiers. But you can see there we have the appropriate placeholders in the system to actually store those intercompany legal agreements and then ultimately submit them through the ATO. At this stage, I'm just going to leave Integrator now and just jump back to the slide deck for a couple of sort of closing comments in the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, okay. Let's. So just to summarise our solution, so you can see over there on the screen, we've got Bob doing a lot of the preparation of the numeric disclosures for Part A of the local file, which then feeds directly into CCH Integrator, and then for you as a user to complete Part B and upload your attachments, and then ultimately validate and electronically file to the tax office. You can work collaboratively, as Jim was saying, within your own organisation, in-house tax and financial teams, as well as working with your advisors as well, collaboratively during the review process. And also, as Jim mentioned before, we've really designed Bob to be a really easy transition away from Excel, where it has a really familiar Office user interface.
Exactly.
In terms of next steps, so please do contact us for further information around commercials and pricing and other information you might require. Timing, so for early balances or 31 March year ends as well, wanting to take advantage of the ATO's admin concession, Bob's available today for you to help with that, preparing your Part A of the local file. It is also worth mentioning to you as well that for those of you who have already gone well down the track of preparing a lot of your Part A disclosures in, say, an Excel template, that's okay. We can still feed that through Bob, which will then go into CCH Integrator. So what you'll be doing there is still using Bob, but you'll be probably more benefiting from Bob in year 2 through the preparation process of automation of that numeric data and preparation, rather than doing it in year 1 if you're very far down the track.
Yep.
And then really the last point to mention is we are going to be developing future outputs out of Bob. So there's a very wide-ranging application. So he can help with GST analytics as well, but we're specifically talking about non-SGEs who still need to complete their IDS. We will be also launching in the second half of this year an IDS output to help streamline and automate the preparation of Section A of your IDS.
Yep. Probably one disclosure remark too, there's already been a number of organisations, particularly early balances and large service firms who have already purchased and adopted and already implemented Bob as well. So yeah, there's quite a lot of activity at the moment in the marketplace in terms of people getting up and running and getting ready and trying to get ahead of the filing deadline. So
absolutely. I mean, as everyone knows, there's legislation that's just been passed as well. So there's huge penalties that apply if you do lodge any of this information late. So certainly, if you can get ahead now and get the process started.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for your time today and attending, and please reach out to us on one of those contact details there, email or phone, if you want further information.
Thank you.
Thank you.